The moment you decide how to treat someone who can do nothing for you, that's the moment your life quietly reveals who you really are. The rain had already soaked through the edges of the neon sign when Ethan pushed open the diner door, the bell above it chiming with a tired, hollow ring that barely anyone looked up to notice. It was nearly closing time, the kind of late hour where conversations dropped into murmurs and coffee refills came slower, where only the last stragglers and the truly exhausted remained. Ethan stepped inside like he didn't belong to the warmth, his jacket damp and worn at the seams, droplets trailing onto the checkered floor as he paused just long enough to scan the room. A couple in the corner laughed softly over pie, a trucker hunched over his plate, and behind the counter, a young woman moved with quiet efficiency, her ponytail slightly loose, her eyes focused but tired. Clara Bennett didn't look up right away, not until the manager's voice cut low from behind her, "We're about to close. Make it quick if he orders anything." Ethan caught it, the edge in that tone, the dismissal already decided before he even spoke. He stepped forward anyway, sliding onto the stool closest to the register, his hands resting lightly on the counter as if trying not to take up too much space. Clara approached with a small notepad, offering a polite smile that didn't feel forced, even at this hour. "Hey there," she said, her voice warm in a way that didn't match the cold dripping from his coat. "What can I get for you tonight?" Ethan hesitated, glancing briefly at the menu above, his eyes tracing the cheapest corner like he already knew where to look. "What's the least expensive thing you've got?" he asked, his tone soft, almost apologetic. Clara blinked once, not in judgment, just in surprise, then followed his gaze. "That'd be the oatmeal," she said, tapping the board lightly with her pen, $2.99. Ethan nodded, reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small handful of coins, setting them carefully on the counter as if counting mattered more than dignity. "That'll do," he said quietly. Behind Clara, the manager let out a faint scoff, not loud, but loud enough. "Oatmeal this late, figures." Clara ignored it, or at least pretended to, writing the order down with the same care she would have given a steak and egg special. "Coming right up," she said, meeting Ethan's eyes for a brief second longer than necessary, something unspoken passing there, not pity, not curiosity, just recognition. As she turned to prepare the bowl, Ethan let his gaze drift around the diner again, taking in every detail, every glance that lingered too long, every subtle shift of shoulders when someone decided he wasn't worth noticing. The heat from the grill filled the air, the scent of coffee lingered, but none of it quite reached him where he sat today. Then, a moment later, Clara returned, setting down not just the oatmeal, but a steaming mug beside it, the dark liquid curling gently with warmth. Ethan looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "I didn't order coffee," he said. Clara gave a small shrug, casual, almost effortless. "You looked like you needed something warm," she replied, already turning away before he could question it further. No charge mentioned. No hesitation. Just a quiet decision made in less than a second. And as Ethan wrapped his hand slowly around the mug, feeling the heat seep into his skin, something shifted behind his eyes, subtle but real, like the first crack in a wall he hadn't realized he'd built. Clara moved back behind the counter, her motion steady but her mind no longer entirely on the routine she had repeated hundreds of times before, because something about the way that man held the mug, like it mattered more than it should, stayed with her longer than she expected. She glanced at him once, then quickly looked away, telling herself not to overthink it, not tonight, not when her feet ached and the clock on the wall felt like it had stopped moving hours ago. Ethan took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat settle, his eyes lowering to the bowl of oatmeal in front of him, simple, plain, nothing impressive, but it was not the food that held his attention. It was the absence of judgment, the quiet dignity in the way it had been served. He lifted the spoon, tasting it without hurry. Observing everything the way he always did, the chipped edge of the bowl, the faded laminate on the counter, the reflection of fluorescent light across the surface, and beyond that, the way Clara checked on every customer with the same measured care, even the ones who barely acknowledged her presence. Minutes passed, and the diner grew quieter, the couple in the corner paid and left, the trucker slid cash under his plate and walked out, leaving behind only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes being cleared. The manager leaned against the register, scrolling through his phone, then looked up again at Ethan with a thin, impatient expression. "You planning on sitting there all night?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice this time. Clara stiffened slightly but kept wiping down the counter, her back turned just enough to avoid direct confrontation. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the remaining coins, letting them rest in his palm before placing them beside the empty bowl. "I might need a few more minutes," he said calmly, his tone even, not defensive, not apologetic. The manager scoffed, pushing himself upright. "This is not a shelter. You pay, you eat, you go." The words hung in the air heavier than they should have. Clara turned then, setting the cloth down slowly, her eyes moving from the manager to Ethan, then back again. "He is not bothering anyone," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the kind that did not ask for permission. The manager narrowed his eyes. "And you are not paid to argue with me." Clara exhaled, steadying herself, feeling that familiar tension tighten in her chest, the one that always came when doing the right thing threatened the little stability she had left. She stepped closer to the counter, placing her hand lightly over the coins Ethan had set down, sliding them back toward him. "It is covered," she said, not looking at the manager now, only at Ethan, as if the decision had already been made. Ethan's gaze lifted to meet hers, searching, not for explanation, but for intent. "You do not have to do that," he said. Clara shook her head once. "I know," she replied simply. That was it. No speech, no justification, just a line drawn quietly in a place where no one expected it. The manager let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, throwing his hands up as he turned away. But the damage, if it was damage, had already been done. Ethan leaned back slightly on the stool, studying Clara with a new focus, not as part of the environment, not as a passing interaction, but as something rare, something uncalculated. "Why?" he asked after a moment, the question direct, stripped of anything else. Clara paused, considering it, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was not used to anyone asking. She glanced at the empty diner, then back at him, her expression soft but certain. "Because everyone deserves to feel like they can sit somewhere without being pushed out," she said, her voice carrying a quiet truth that did not need to be louder to be heard. Ethan let the words settle, repeating them silently in his mind, as if testing their weight, their sincerity, their cost. And for the first time that night, something deeper shifted inside him, not just curiosity now, but respect, the kind that does not come easily, the kind that cannot be bought, only witnessed. The rain outside had not let up, tapping steadily against the windows like a quiet reminder that the world beyond the diner was still cold and indifferent, but inside, something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, as Ethan remained seated longer than he needed to, no longer just observing but listening, not to the sounds around him, but to the silence between moments, to the way Clara moved without expecting recognition. She refilled the sugar dispensers, stacked clean mugs, wiped down surfaces already clean, each motion efficient yet unhurried, as if she refused to let exhaustion turn her into someone careless. Ethan watched her, then glanced at the register where the manager had returned to his phone, clearly uninterested in anything that did not directly affect profit. "You always do that?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice calm, drawing Clara's attention back to him. "Do what?" she replied, leaning slightly against the counter, giving herself a second to breathe. "Pay for strangers," he said, not accusing, just curious. Clara gave a small shrug, almost dismissing the weight of it. "Not always," she answered honestly, "just when it feels like it matters." Ethan studied her again, noting how easily she said it, how it did not sound rehearsed or performative. "And how do you decide that?" he asked. Clara looked at him, really looked this time, her eyes scanning his face as if the answer was already there. "You can tell when someone is having a harder night than they are willing to admit," she said softly, then added with a faint smile, "and sometimes a warm meal is the only thing you can fix in 10 minutes. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh but not quite, as if he recognized the truth in that more than he expected. Before he could respond, the bell above the door rang again, sharp this time, cutting through the calm that had settled. A group of 3 walked in, well-dressed, their voices louder than necessary, the kind of confidence that filled space without asking. One of them, a man in a tailored coat, paused near the entrance, his gaze drifting across the diner until it landed on Ethan, and something about that look changed, sharpened. He leaned toward his friends, saying something under his breath that made them chuckle, then approached the counter with a smirk that did not try to hide itself. "Is this place still serving?" he asked, though it was obvious they were. Clara straightened, offering the same polite tone she gave everyone. "We are closing soon, but I can take your order." The man's attention, however, was not on her anymore. He tilted his head slightly toward Ethan. "You might want to clean up your seating policy," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, not exactly the kind of crowd that builds a reputation. The words hung there, heavier than before, because now they were intentional, designed to be heard, designed to separate. Clara's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, but she did not respond immediately. Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable, his fingers loosely wrapped around the empty mug. The manager looked up. Again, this time more alert, sensing the shift in tone, the potential for conflict or at least discomfort that he might need to manage. Clara stepped slightly forward, positioning herself between the man and Ethan, not aggressively, just enough to redirect the moment. "Everyone is welcome here," she said, her voice steady, even if her pulse had quickened. The man raised an eyebrow, amused. "That's so," he replied, glancing at Ethan again with thinly veiled judgment. "Even him?" And in that single question, the room seemed to shrink, waiting, not for Ethan to answer, but for Clara to decide exactly who she was willing to be when it mattered most. Clara did not hesitate, not even for a second, because hesitation would have meant doubt, and doubt was not something she could afford tonight, not when everything she had left depended on holding on to the one thing no one could take from her. She met the man's gaze directly, her posture straightening just enough to make her answer unmistakable. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "especially him." The man let out a short laugh, glancing back at his friends as if inviting them to share in the moment, but the humor did not quite land the way he expected. "You are serious?" he pressed, his tone sharpening slightly. Clara nodded once. "I am." The diner seemed quieter now, even the rain outside fading into the background as the tension settled across the room. The manager stepped forward quickly this time, his voice low but urgent. "Clara," he warned, "do not make this harder than it needs to be." Clara did not look at him. "It is already as hard as it needs to be," she replied, still focused on the man in front of her. Ethan remained still, watching everything unfold with a level of attention that went far beyond curiosity now, his expression composed but his thoughts shifting rapidly, measuring not just what was being said, but what it cost her to say it. The well-dressed man leaned slightly on the counter, lowering his voice just enough to make it more personal, more pointed. "You realize people like him do not belong in places like this," he said, his words coated in certainty. Clara inhaled slowly, steadying herself, then answered in a tone that carried more weight than volume. "People belong wherever they are treated like people," she said, each word deliberate, leaving no space for misinterpretation. For a brief moment, the man had no response, his confidence flickering as if he had expected resistance but not conviction. Behind him, his friend shifted uncomfortably, the atmosphere no longer entertaining, no longer light. The manager rubbed his temple, clearly calculating the potential loss of a paying customer against the inconvenience of a waitress who refused to comply. "Sir," he said quickly, turning his attention to the man, "we can seat you right over here, away from—" He paused, searching for a word that would not sound as bad as what he meant. Clara finally turned then, her eyes meeting the manager's, and something in that look made him stop mid-sentence. It was not anger, not defiance in the usual sense, but something quieter and far more difficult to argue with. It was certainty. Ethan shifted slightly on the stool, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter as he stood, not in surrender, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of the moment that had just unfolded. "I can leave," he said, his voice calm, breaking the silence in a way that redirected attention back to him. Clara turned immediately. "No," she said, too quickly this time, then softened her tone, "you do not have to." Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, as if committing the moment to memory, then looked toward the man who had questioned his place. "It seems like she has already decided who belongs here," he said evenly. The words were simple, but they carried something beneath them, something the other man could not quite place. The tension lingered, unresolved, hanging in the air like the storm outside that refused to pass, and in that space, something had quietly shifted, not just in how Clara saw Ethan, or how Ethan saw Clara, but in how the entire room now understood that this was no longer about a cheap meal or a late-night order. It was about a line that had been drawn, and a choice that had been made without apology. The man in the tailored coat let out a slow breath, the kind people use when they realize a situation is no longer bending in their favor, and for a moment he simply stared at Clara as if trying to decide whether she was worth the trouble or not. Then he straightened, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve, his tone cooling into something more controlled. "Fine," he said, glancing briefly at Ethan again, "if this is the standard you are setting, I will take my business somewhere else." He turned slightly, expecting his friends to follow without question, but there was hesitation now, a flicker of uncertainty that had not been there when they walked in. One of them shrugged awkwardly before stepping back, and just like that, the moment lost its audience. The manager forced a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable, clearly calculating, but unable to undo what had already happened. "Sir, there is no need to leave," he insisted quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. The man waved him off. "There is," he replied, then added under his breath, "just loud enough, standards matter." And with that, he walked out into the rain, the doorbell chiming once more, but this time the sound felt different, lighter, as if something unnecessary had just exited the room. Silence settled again, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried weight, consequence, and something else, clarity. The manager exhaled sharply, turning toward Clara with a look that mixed frustration and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you just cost this place?" he demanded. Clara did not flinch. "No," she answered honestly, "but I know what it would have cost me if I did nothing." The manager shook his head, clearly not satisfied, but also aware that pushing further might only make things worse in front of the one customer still sitting at the counter. He muttered something under his breath and retreated toward the back office, leaving the two of them alone again in the soft hum of the diner. Ethan watched Clara for a moment longer before speaking. "You could have ignored it," he said quietly. Clara picked up the cloth again, wiping the same spot on the counter, more out of habit than necessity. "I could have," she admitted, "but then I would have remembered it tomorrow, and the day after that." She glanced at him briefly. "And that would have been harder." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized, because regret was something he knew well, something money had never been able to erase. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a worn bill, placing it gently on the counter. It was more than the cost of the meal, more than enough to cover everything and then some. Clara noticed immediately and slid it back toward him without hesitation. "You already paid," she said. Ethan did not move the bill. "For the food," he replied, his voice steady, "not for what you did." Clara shook her head, her expression soft but firm. "Kindness is not something you charge extra for," she said. The words landed differently than anything else that night, simple but undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan said nothing, just looking at her as if trying to measure something that could not be measured. Then, slowly, he folded the bill and slipped it back into his pocket, not out of defeat, but out of respect. "Then I owe you something I cannot pay for tonight," he said. Clara gave a faint smile, the first one that reached her eyes. "Then maybe you just pay it forward," she replied. Ethan held that thought for a second longer than necessary, as if committing it to memory, then nodded once. Outside, the rain began to ease, the steady rhythm softening into something lighter, and inside, without either of them fully realizing it, a moment had been set into motion that would not end when the door closed behind him, but would follow them both into whatever came next. By the time Ethan stepped out into the night, the rain had softened into a thin mist, the kind that clung quietly to the air instead of falling hard against it, and for a moment he stood just outside the diner, his hand still on the door handle, as if something inside him had not quite finished processing what had just happened. He glanced back through the glass, watching Clara move behind the counter, her figure slightly blurred by the reflection of the neon lights, and there was a strange feeling settling in his chest, unfamiliar, unpolished. Something he could not categorize the way he usually did with everything else in his world. Then he turned and walked toward the dark street, his shoes stepping through shallow puddles, each step slower than the last, not because he was unsure where he was going, but because for the first time in a long while, he was thinking about why. Inside the diner, Clara finished wiping the last table, her shoulders finally relaxing as the weight of the night began to catch up with her. The manager reappeared briefly, giving her a look that said more than his words did, but he did not argue again, not tonight, and that in itself felt like a quiet victory. She clocked out a few minutes later, pulling her jacket tighter around her as she stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face, refreshing but sharp. She did not see Ethan standing across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of a parked car, watching just long enough to see her walk away safely before turning in the opposite direction. The next morning arrived faster than either of them expected, the grey sky replaced by a pale, early light that filtered through the city like a reset button no one asked for. Clara returned to the diner for her shift, her routine unchanged, her thoughts already moving past the night before because she did not have the luxury of holding on to moments for too long. But something felt different the second she pushed open the door. It was subtle at first, the way the manager stood straighter behind the counter, the way the usual morning chatter was replaced with hushed voices, the way two unfamiliar men in suits stood near the booths, speaking quietly while scanning the room. Clara slowed her steps, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to make sense of it. "What is going on?" she asked, setting her bag down behind the counter. The manager looked at her, then quickly looked away, as if unsure how much to say. "Just keep working," he muttered, his tone tense. Clara frowned but did not push, grabbing a coffee pot and moving toward the tables, though her attention remained fixed on the unfamiliar presence in the room. The bell above the door rang again, but this time, every head turned at once. Clara did too, and when she saw him, she stopped completely. Ethan walked in, but he was not the same man from the night before. The worn jacket was gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored dark suit that fit him with quiet precision, his posture different, his presence unmistakable. Behind him, a second man followed, holding a folder, his expression professional, alert. The room shifted instantly, not just in attention, but in understanding. Clara stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her mind trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the one she had served oatmeal to just hours before. Ethan's eyes found hers immediately, not searching, not uncertain, just steady, as if he had already decided how this moment would unfold. The manager stepped forward quickly now, his entire demeanor transformed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice suddenly respectful, almost eager, "we did not expect you this morning." The name landed like a quiet shockwave, moving through the room without needing to be repeated. Clara's grip tightened slightly on the coffee pot, her breath catching in a way she could not quite control. And in that moment, everything she thought she understood about the night before began to unravel, not because it had been false, but because it had been something far more intentional than she ever imagined. Clara felt the weight of the room shift in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with realization, because the man she had served the cheapest meal to, the man she had defended without hesitation, now stood in front of her as someone the entire diner suddenly recognized and responded to without question, and for a moment she could not move, her thoughts catching up all at once, connecting details she had not known to notice before. Ethan did not rush the moment, did not speak immediately, because he understood that the truth did not need to be forced, it only needed to be seen clearly. He took a few steps forward, his gaze never leaving Clara, even as the manager hovered nearby, eager, almost nervous now. "We were not aware you would be visiting this location personally," the manager continued, his tone overly polished, as if trying to rewrite the entire atmosphere of the diner with his words alone. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging him without fully engaging, then shifted his attention back to Clara. "I was here last night," he said simply. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight now than anything else that had been said since he walked in. Clara swallowed, setting the coffee pot down slowly on the nearest table, her hand steady even if her thoughts were not. "I know," she replied, her voice softer than before, not uncertain, but recalibrating. The man beside Ethan stepped forward slightly, opening the folder he carried, his presence formal, structured, the kind that followed rules and enforced them. Ethan raised a hand gently, stopping him before he could speak. "Not yet," he said, his tone calm but decisive. The man nodded and stepped back without question. Ethan took another step closer to the counter, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel personal again, not performative. "You treated me like I belonged here," he continued, his voice steady, his words deliberate, "before you had any reason to." Clara held his gaze, the initial shock fading into something clearer, something grounded in the same instinct that had guided her the night before. "That should not require a reason," she said quietly. Ethan's expression shifted, not into a smile, but into something deeper, a recognition that went beyond agreement. Behind them, the manager shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation was unfolding without his control. "Mr. Whitmore," he interjected carefully, "if there were any misunderstandings last night, I can assure you," Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the interruption without fully giving it attention. "There were no misunderstandings," he said, his tone even, cutting through the attempt with quiet clarity. The manager stopped speaking immediately. Ethan looked back at Clara, reaching into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulling out a folded receipt, slightly worn, the edges softened from being handled more than once. He placed it gently on the counter between them. Clara's eyes dropped to it, and she recognized it instantly, the handwriting, the small line she had written without thinking, without expecting it to matter beyond that moment. "Because cheap meals do not make cheap people." The word sat there now, no longer just a passing note, but something that had carried into this moment, something that had been remembered. Clara looked up again, meeting Ethan's gaze, understanding beginning to settle in fully now. "You kept it," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Ethan nodded once. "I did," he replied. "Because it said more about you than anything else I could have learned by asking." The room remained silent, every movement paused, every person aware that something important was unfolding, even if they did not yet understand the full shape of it. Clara took a small breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, because now the moment felt different, no longer uncertain, no longer confusing, but clear in a way that made everything that had happened the night before make sense in a way she had not expected. And in that clarity, the line between who he had appeared to be and who he truly was no longer mattered as much as what she had chosen to do when she believed he was nothing at all. The silence in the diner no longer felt tense, it felt expectant, like the moment just before something irreversible takes shape, and Ethan understood that what came next would define not just how this moment ended, but what it meant. He glanced briefly toward the man standing beside him, giving a subtle nod that signaled it was time. The man stepped forward again, opening the folder with measured precision, his voice clear and professional as he addressed the room, though his eyes remained focused on Clara. "Miss Bennett, as of this morning, this location is officially under the ownership of Whitmore Dining Group," he said, each word landing with quiet authority, "and a review of management practices has already begun." The manager's face lost color instantly, his posture shifting from defensive to uncertain in a matter of seconds. "Sir, I can explain," he started, but Ethan raised his hand again, stopping him without raising his voice. "You will have the opportunity to explain," Ethan said calmly, "just not right now." The man beside him continued, turning a page in the folder. "Preliminary findings indicate consistent reports of employee wage discrepancies and inappropriate treatment of customers," he added, his tone unchanged, factual, leaving no room for interpretation. The manager stepped back, his confidence dissolving under the weight of words that were no longer opinions, but records. Clara stood still, absorbing it all, her eyes moving between Ethan and the unfolding situation, understanding now that the night before had not just been a random encounter, but a test that had revealed far more than she had realized. Ethan turned back to her fully, the rest of the room fading into the background as he spoke again, this time not as an observer, but as someone making a decision. "Last night, you said something that stayed with me," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a depth that made it impossible to ignore, "that people deserve a place where they are treated like people." Clara did not respond immediately, but she did not look away either. Ethan reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out a small card, placing it beside the folded receipt on the counter. "I want to build something around that idea," he continued, "not just here, but across every location we own." Clara glanced down at the card, then back up at him, her expression cautious now, not because she doubted him, but because she understood the weight of what he was offering without him having to say it outright. A program that guarantees a certain number of meals every day, no questions asked, no judgment, Ethan said, his tone firm, already seeing it take shape, and I want someone who actually believes in it to help lead it. The room seemed to hold its breath again, not because they did not understand what he meant, but because they did. Clara felt it too, the shift from moment to opportunity, from instinct to responsibility, and for the first time since he walked in that morning, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. "Why me?" she asked quietly. Ethan did not take long to answer. "Because you did not know who I was," he said, his voice simple, direct, and it did not change how you treated me. Clara let that settle, the memory of the night before playing back in her mind, not as something extraordinary, but as something she would have done again without thinking. She looked around the diner, at the worn tables, the familiar counter, the place that had been her routine, her stability, and then back at Ethan, at the possibility standing in front of her. "If I say yes," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "it cannot just be about good intentions." Ethan nodded immediately. "It will not be," he replied. "It will be measurable, accountable, real." Clara studied him for a moment longer, not the suit, not the name, but the man who had sat quietly with a $2 meal and accepted kindness without expecting it. And in that moment, she understood that this was not about him proving something to her anymore, it was about whether she was willing to take what she believed and turn it into something bigger than herself. Clara did not answer right away, not because she did not know what she believed, but because she understood that saying yes would change everything in a way that could not be undone. And for someone who had spent so long holding her life together one shift at a time, that kind of change carried weight. She looked down at the receipt again, the ink slightly smudged where her pen had pressed too hard the night before, the words simple, almost careless when she wrote them, but now they felt like a promise she had made without realizing it. Because cheap meals do not make cheap people. She let out a slow breath, then lifted her eyes back to Ethan, her expression steady, grounded in the same quiet certainty that had guided her from the beginning. "Then it has to stay about the people," she said, her voice calm but firm, "not the headlines, not the branding, not making anyone look good." Ethan did not hesitate. "It will," he replied, and there was no performance in it, no need to convince, just a statement of intent that matched the weight of her condition. Clara nodded once, as if sealing something unspoken between them, then added, "And if it stops being real, I walk away." Ethan's expression softened slightly, something close to respect turning into something deeper, something more personal. "Then I would expect you to," he said. The room around them slowly began to breathe again, the tension easing, replaced by a quiet awareness that something significant had just taken place, even if most of them did not fully understand what it meant yet. The man with the folder closed it carefully, stepping back as if his role in this moment had reached its end, while the manager stood frozen near the counter, no longer the center of authority he had believed himself to be. Clara reached for the card Ethan had placed on the counter, her fingers brushing against it lightly before picking it up, as if testing whether it was real. It felt heavier than it looked, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it represented. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron, not as a decision made lightly, but as one she intended to carry forward with purpose. Ethan watched the gesture, understanding that it meant more than any immediate answer could have. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal, as if the rest of the room no longer mattered. Clara looked back at him, waiting. He gestured slightly toward the counter, toward the spot where he had sat the night before. "I will always remember that you treated me the same when I had nothing to offer," he said. Clara gave a small, genuine smile, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. "You had something to offer," she replied softly. Ethan tilted his head slightly, curious. "What was that?" he asked. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "The chance to do the right thing," she said. The word settled between them, simple, but complete, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added. Outside, the clouds had begun to part, the first hint of sunlight breaking through in thin, quiet streaks that reflected off the diner windows, soft but unmistakable. Inside, the place looked the same as it always had, the same tables, the same counter, the same worn edges, but Something about it felt different now, as if the space itself had been redefined by a single night, by a single choice. Ethan took a step back, giving Clara the space she needed, not pulling her into anything she was not ready for, but not walking away either. And in that quiet balance, something new began, not just a program, not just a change in policy, but a connection built on something far rarer than wealth or opportunity, something that had started with a $2 meal and a simple act of kindness, and had grown into a future neither of them had expected, but both of them were now ready to step into.